Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about unions' goals. So, when asked what union laborers wanted for their workers, AFL founder Samuel Gompers said, "More, more, and still more." It's a good quote to show their motivation and probably their willingness to fight for the union members, but it can't be taken literally by economists, the most boring people in the world. If we tried to take it literally, that would mean that unions wanted the highest possible wage, so moving all the way up along the demand curve until it was about to cross the y-axis. So of course, the average wage would be maximized at that point. It would be great, but firms would only be willing and able to hire one worker. So everyone else is going to be out of work. So for that one worker, really great. They're earning a ton of money, but not great for literally everyone else. So one of the most popular conceptions of unions uses a model where they act like a monopolist. So a monopolist is the only one who sells a product. In this case, a union is the only one who sells labor. Now, if you want that product, or in this case, these workers, you have to go through the monopolist. Unions go and they negotiate the terms of employment with firms, which is a little different from selling a product. It's not a perfect metaphor, but this comparison is similar enough to be able to work and provide some light on how unions act. Now, we say the firm's goal is to maximize profits, or technically to maximize value for their shareholders, but how they do that is through maximizing the profit they earn. So the question is, what are unions' goals? What do they try to maximize? There's a few different theories about this. So the first is the rent maximization model. So the union rent maximization model is a counterpart to the model where firms try to maximize their profits. Now, this isn't always true for firms. Sometimes they try to maximize revenues. Sometimes they incorporate social goals that diminish some of their profits. But it's largely true, and it's a good model to work from to try to understand how firms operate. So let's use the simple model of monopolist to explore how a union is going to act. If a monopolist is facing a downward sloping demand curve, in the figure on the right, we're looking at the top, so figure 12.2. So the demand curve is going to be from point D to point D, that curve. Now their marginal revenue, or the revenue that they gain for each additional sale, is going to be below that in the line represented by MR. Now it's going to be lower because to sell more units, firms have to lower the price that they're going to sell it. So each unit, if they want to sell more, each unit is bringing in less and less revenue. Now, the marginal cost curve is going to slope upward. You can also think of this as the supply curve. Now, if it's been too long since you've had econ class, don't worry. I'm going to include a video explaining the monopolist model so you have a little bit more background if you need it to be able to understand this. So the monopolist is trying to determine what price and what level of output they want to produce at. That's what we're trying to use this model to figure out. So assuming they're trying to maximize profit, they're going to produce at the quantity where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. So where that MR curve crosses that MC curve at that point. In this case, it's going to be point A. That's the quantity that they're going to produce at. That's a profit maximizing quantity. But that's not going to be the price that they're going to sell at. So the price that they're going to sell at is you trace that Q1 through point A all the way up to where that point hits the demand curve. In this case, it's labeled point B. Now that's the price that they're going to sell at. So now figure 12.3 on the right here, this kind of the one on the bottom, uses the same monopolist model. But this time we're focusing on the labor union as a monopolist. So what they're trying to do is to determine the wage at which they want to sell labor, or basically what wage you're going to negotiate with the firm or with management. The demand curve is the employer's demand for workers. Now, from the firm's perspective, the marginal revenue curve is the additional revenue brought in by the next worker. For the union, the marginal revenue curve can be thought of as the change in the total wage payments going to union workers. The supply curve is the wage that's necessary to get that many workers willing to enter the workforce and work within that industry or within that firm. Now, in practice, in this model, unions act just like the profit maximizing firm would. So they choose the quantity of labor or the number of workers with jobs where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, or in this case, where the marginal revenue MR curve crosses the supply, the S curve. This is going to be, again, at point A. So that's the quantity that they're going, the number of workers that they're going to want, quantity of L1. But remember, they're not going to use that to determine the wage. They're going to try to negotiate the wage at point B, where that quantity intersects with the demand curve. And that's going to give them a wage of W1. Now, if the wage was at point A, the firm would pay the workers the marginal revenue product. They would pay them exactly how much revenue those employers brought into the firm, or those employees brought into the firm, excuse me. But the union is going to want higher wages for their members. Obviously, they're going to try to get more and more and still more. So the difference between point B and point A is called the rent. In economics, rent means the return over and above what we would think of as the equilibrium profit, or where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. It's going to be above that. The problem is unions have a difficult question. So how are they going to deal with those who are not employed at higher wages? So for instance, they could try to negotiate wages at point C. So employees, members of the union, are paid even higher wages. But firms are going to be able to pay fewer workers. So the overall employment in the industry or at that firm is going to be lower. Some people in the union are going to be left out of work. Conversely, they could choose point E. This is a lower wage for each worker, but more workers are going to be employed. So what unions have to do is consider the good of all of their members, weighing the wage gains from higher wages with the employment gains from lower wages. And this is something that's more difficult to try to maximize than firms that are just trying to maximize profits. Another way to conceptualize unions to try to understand their decision-making process is called the wage bill maximization model. The former Harvard economist and Secretary of Labor John Dunlop considered this the most accurate model of union behavior back in the 1940s. So the total wage bill refers to the total amount of wages that are being paid by firms to their workers. We can also think of it as the average wage times the number of workers. Now, the marginal revenue line in this graph represents the increase in the total wage bill from adding one additional worker, or alternatively, the decrease from firing one additional worker. So now the point that's going to maximize the total wage bill is going to be where marginal revenue equals 0. At any point where marginal revenue is positive, we can increase marginal revenue by just adding another worker. If we try to increase the number of workers when the marginal revenue is negative, then we'll make marginal revenue smaller. We're going to have to subtract away because that additional worker is making them less productive instead of more productive. So it's going to be maximized where marginal revenue equals 0. So that's at point A in the figure here on the right, on figure 12.4. So now the wage is going to be determined by where that quantity, L1, that quantity there at point A, is going to hit the demand curve if we trace it up. In this case, it's going to be point B, and the wage is going to be W1. However, we still end up with some problems with this model. There still are some shortcomings. For instance, point B is below the labor supply curve, which means that at that wage, we would not have as many workers willing to work as that point, says that we would. So in this case, what's going to be happening is unions are going to be artificially keeping the wages down to get more workers employed, and they're somehow forcing workers to work at a wage below their reservation wage. So workers consider it's better for them to just not work, to leave the labor market and only engage in leisure. But in this case, somehow unions are encouraging them, forcing them, convincing, whatever, getting them into labor force below their reservation wage. So you can imagine this happening in an extreme scenario. Maybe there's a deep recession or some extreme economic uncertainty. But under normal circumstances, you're not going to see this happen. Likewise, if wages are higher at W2, it's difficult to imagine a union negotiating lower wages at the next round of negotiations just so they could get more workers employed. It's not something we would expect to happen in the real world. All right, so for the next one. Unions are comprised of a large number of members who are, their own individuals. It's not just one hive mind going on. Everyone has their different goals, desires, ambitions, and not just for their personal lives, but different like number of hours they want to work, different demands for their wages, different willingness to put in effort, a whole bunch of different, different things. They're different across a large spectrum of characteristics. They're not just operating as one the same goal. So if you analyze or try to analyze a union as one big blob, basically, it's going to suffer from drawbacks. So like we saw in the last two models, there are shortcomings that we have to deal with. Doesn't quite fit what happens in reality well. So another way to understand how unions operate is to look at them through the lens of the median member. So in political science and in public choice theory, we consider the median voter and how politicians move towards what the average voter wants to try to be as popular as possible in elections. So now, in this case, consider the differences that level of seniority would have on the desire for wages. So when demand falls and a firm needs to fire some workers, especially when there's a union, they tend to fire the most recently hired, the least senior employees. Often with the union, it's explicit that they have to do the layoffs based on seniority. But even if there's no union where it's like explicitly stated, it's also typically what firms tend to do. So we would imagine that the most senior workers, those whose jobs are safest at any time, are going to desire the highest wage increases, while the newest workers are going to prefer that the union demand lower wages so they can keep their job. So here we have figure 12.5 from your textbook, and it shows basically shows us very simply with the model, just with the demand curve, which represents the different wage demands of union members. You have more senior workers at the higher end of the wage demand and the least senior workers on the lower end. So in practice, how would a union deal with its members having such a wage preference? So according to the idea of the median voter theorem, what the union is going to do is adopt the position of the members in the middle of all the wage demands. Someone offering the median position would, win the most support from union workers. Or if the union decided to adopt it, that's the level that would get votes from at least 50% of the, that slight majority of workers. So in the case of the figure here, the wage W subscript median at point A is going to be the wage that the union negotiates for. Anything too high or below won't be able to win 50% of the votes. Now, this model, this idea is able to address the reality that different members have different interests and different goals, rather than imagining a union acts in complete lockstep, like they're all clones of each other or all robots. It takes into account the differences between people. However, there is still some problems with this. If we think of this model working over time, then once the wage is set in one period at the median wage, the W median at point A, then a bunch of workers below that are going to be let go. So now what was the median worker before is now the least senior worker. So they've got the least seniority. So the next year, the new median wage that's desired is W median 2 in this figure. So the union's going to raise their wage demands by quite a bit, and a lot more workers are going to be fired. If you rinse and repeat this multiple times, eventually only one worker is going to be hired at an extremely high wage. So it doesn't work very well for understanding, the union decision-making over multiple periods. Looking at it just as a snapshot in time, it can explain how they try to determine what wage you're going to try to negotiate. Over time, we see this problem happen. It also assumes that firms are going to be willing to agree to pay any wage, but past a certain point, a firm can't stay in business, and they won't have room to negotiate higher and higher wages. So all in all, this is a helpful model, but it's not extremely realistic to use to understand what's happened in unions in the real world if you were trying to take it and use it over time. There's a lot of models like this, like the three we talked about before, other models we talked about in this class, where they have these shortcomings that we have to talk about, but it's important they can shed some light, try to give you some idea of what's going on. Okay, so next is the idea of utilities. They call the utility maximization model. And this has received particularly strong attention from economists. Basically, the utility maximization model assumes that instead of having one singular goal, whether it's maximizing wage rents, maximizing the wage bill, or winning the median members' vote for the negotiated wage, the union's goal is to maximize utility. So the idea of utility takes into account a number of goals. So rather than just one, it's a lot of them. Some of them are going to complement each other. Some of them are going to be in opposition to each other. Some workers may want to maximize employment. Some may want to maximize wages. Some may want to maximize work stability. Some employment guarantees that they're not going to get laid off when there's an economic downturn. Some may want to focus on working conditions. Now, the list can go on and on. And we can represent the union's goals by the following function. Very simply, a union's utility function, U, is a function of wage and labor. Now, wage is the average wage being paid to employees. Labor is the number of workers. This is a simple model. It's only considering two goals. We could do more. We could include like the 5 or 6 or however many I just mentioned. But the more we add, the more complicated things get. If we work with 2, we can, work with actual graphs and figures, and you can see the relationship. Once we get into like 3 dimensions, it gets more difficult, and then obviously we can't show like 4 or 5 dimension stuff. So figure 12.6 here shows a simple indifference curve for the union for wages and employment. So there's this trade-off between you get the higher and higher wage, you're going to get lower employment, and vice versa. If you lower the wage, you get higher employment, larger number of workers that are working. So firm wants some combination of high wages and high employment. So the indifference curve represents the universe of choices that provide the same level of utility. Now the curve you can see is almost an L shape. And that's because the wages and employment are not close substitutes in the eye of union. They're competing with each other. They're opposite things. When they move, one moves in one direction, the other moves in the opposite direction. All right. So like, what good are high wages if you're out of work? Let's suppose that the union is currently at point A. So there, the average wage is W1 and the average level of employment is L1. So if there is going to be a reduction in the average wage, it would require a very large increase in union membership to keep them on that indifference curve. In other words, that in order to be willing to suffer the wage decrease, the union is going to have a lot more members get jobs either at that firm or within that industry. Likewise, if they're being faced with layoffs, it's going to take a large wage increase to keep the union happy or to maintain the same level of utility as before. So now, what would the union's utility map look like if the demand for workers for the firm changed? Figure 12.7 is a little cluttered, but it can still shed some light on what's going on. So if the firm's demand curve shifts out to D1, now it didn't include the original demand curve D0 because it would get too cluttered, but it's parallel to D1 going through point A. So the demand curve shifts out to D1, this new higher demand curve where the firm demands more workers. Will the union prefer higher wages or more employment? As you can imagine, they're going to prefer some of both. And we can see that in point B here. So they're on the new indifference curve, U1. So we'll end up with higher wages in the industry and higher employment. So let's say the opposite happened and firms desired fewer workers. Say there's an economic downturn. We would see the exact opposite occur. The union would take some job losses and they would reduce wages some. So now what's useful about the utility maximization model is that it shows that unions care about multiple things. They don't just try to maximize along one dimension. And it should make intuitive sense that this is how unions try to make decisions. I mean, this is how people think in your own life you make decisions, not just trying to maximize one thing. You're taking a whole bunch of different concerns into consideration. So when they take multiple concerns into account, they're going to have a path with the optimal combination of the 2 or could be more dimensions. So in this example, the preferred path is not symmetrical. It's not just a straight line going through there. We see coming out of point A, those the 2 black lines, the arrows on the end, kind of curving. And this is going to make sense depending on whether the union is more concerned about one of the dimensions than the other, or if they're more concerned about the downside risk than the upside risk. Now, the best part of this model is that we can extend it to firms as well. So we can look at the utility maximization model with firm decision making. We can use it to see how union and firm preferences differ and how these differences could play out through a negotiation process. So we can use the marginal revenue product and the average revenue product we talked about a couple of weeks ago to understand the firm's decision-making process. Now, I'm not going to walk you through this. It gets really confusing, and I don't expect you to learn all the mechanics and be able to like reproduce the mechanics for an exam. I don't want to focus on too much of like the technical econ stuff. I want to give you just enough that you can understand, how we're getting these results, why the models imply that these things are going to happen. So I'm just going to skip for this case, in this instance, for what the model is going to tell us. Basically, what it says is there's going to be a range of options where the firm and the union prefer the same thing. Maybe in this case, they're both wanting to decrease the level of employment. Or maybe they want to decrease the wages. It could be either. But there's also a range where they're going to be in conflict, where they both want opposite things. And the only way that one is going to be able to benefit is at the expense of the other. So one gets what they want, the other has to give some stuff up. At first, we might think that this means they would always agree for the range where they both prefer the same thing, but that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes they would be willing to do the same thing if they were up there, if wages or employment were already at that point, but because they're not going into it, that's not really a choice that they have. So when firms and unions are in conflict with each other, the one with the more strong bargaining position is going to end up with the better end of the deal. Okay, so we'll end this by talking briefly about bargaining power. So one of the implications of the utility maximization model is that a range of outcomes exists where the average wage and employment level will fall. Where exactly it falls will depend on which side has more bargaining power. A simple definition of bargaining power is the ability of a party to get the other party to agree to their terms. So there's been a lot of talk about a looming strike for railroad workers if they don't reach some kind of agreement by this fall. Now, right now, prices are high, and the disruption in shipping would be catastrophic, especially with the supply shocks that we're dealing with, the negative supply shocks we're dealing with. Looking at the situation, it's easy to see that the railroad workers have bargaining power. They have more bargaining power than the firms that they would be bargaining with. Not meeting their demands would more negatively impact management and any associated businesses with those railroads more than it would hurt the workers. So we can conceptualize this more formally with just a simple ratio. So the union's bargaining power is the cost to management of agreeing with the union over the cost to management of disagreeing with the union. Now the opposite holds for the management bargaining power. It's the ratio of the cost to the union of disagreeing with management over the cost to the union of agreeing with management. If the cost of disagreeing with the other side is higher than the cost of agreeing, so if the ratio is greater than 1, then the other side has more bargaining power. If the ratio is less than 1, then the opposite holds. So to make this more concrete with an example, if the cost to the union of disagreeing with management is higher than the cost of agreeing, you can say that management has more bargaining power. More costly to disagree than it is to just, submit to their request. Now, for our example, the railroad workers, we would say that they have the bargaining power. So the cost to management of disagreeing, so the total shutdown of all railroad shipping in the United States, is higher than the cost of agreeing to the union. So we would expect management to agree to at least most of the railroad workers' demands. It's important to note that both sides bear a cost, though. If the railroad workers go on strike, they also lose their income. So as a result, both parties try to offset these potential costs. So unions might provide strike benefits. They might, have slightly higher dues, take some of that money and save it for when they go on strike. So that way, the employees don't go completely without income while the firm is on strike. On the other hand, firms might have some kind of insurance against a strike breaking out. And these tactics limiting the losses associated with their actions and with the negotiation process are ways that both parties try to increase their bargaining power in union negotiations. I should also mention that timing is important. So choosing the right time to strike or to negotiate can improve your side's bargaining power. So, for instance, farm workers that are threatening to strike right before harvest, it's going to be a lot more effective. They're going to have more bargaining power than if they do that earlier in the summer. Anytime after the pandemic, with the difficulties with the supply of goods and shipping, whether it's across the world or just across the United States in general, is a good time for railroad workers to be maximizing their bargaining power. On the next set of slides, we're going to be talking about using this idea of bargaining power, talking about the decision-making process behind whether firms should strike, whether companies or firms should allow them to strike rather than negotiating, and when they should come out of strikes.